Hey, everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And wow, you guys have sent over some seriously thought-provoking material.
Yeah, for sure.
We're seeing two really distinct narratives kind of emerge here. One that emphasizes NATO expansion as a trigger for the war,
Right.
and the other that focuses on Putin's ambitions.
It is fascinating how these narratives shape the way people interpret the whole conflict. And I think we've got some insightful analysis here to help us, understand both sides.
Absolutely. So let's start with Professor John Mearsheimer's perspective.
Okay.
Now, he's a big name in international relations, and he's making a pretty bold claim here that the West, by not acknowledging its role in the conflict specifically regarding NATO expansion, is actually making a meaningful peace agreement much harder to achieve.
Yeah, what's striking about Mearsheimer's argument, I think, is that he believes the West's reluctance to acknowledge, its part in all this is a major roadblock to any kind of, resolution. And he argues that any negotiated peace would likely hinge on the West, along with Ukraine accepting two key conditions set by Putin.
Okay, so let's unpack those conditions.
Sure.
What is Putin looking for exactly?
Well, first, Putin demands recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea and those four eastern Ukrainian oblasts.
Right.
Essentially, he wants the West to accept these territories as permanently part of Russia.
Okay.
Second, he insists on a guarantee that Ukraine will remain neutral and never join NATO.
So Putin is drawing a very clear line in the sand here.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's not willing to budge on these points.
It doesn't seem like it, no.
But, if those are the conditions for peace, does Mearsheimer believe that someone like Trump now, back in the political spotlight, could actually broker a lasting deal?
Mearsheimer is actually quite skeptical about that. He points out the immense political pressure Trump would face both domestically and from international allies if he were to accept Putin's demands.
Yeah, I can see that.
And Mearsheimer suggests that the backlash would be so significant that it would likely derail any attempt at a peace agreement.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Accepting those conditions would be a tough pill to swallow for many, especially given the current political climate.
Yeah, for sure.
So if a negotiated peace along those lines is unlikely, what does Mearsheimer see as the most probable outcome of this conflict?
He believes we're heading towards what's often called a frozen conflict.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but can you break it down for us? What does a frozen conflict actually look like in this context?
So imagine a scenario where the active fighting stops, but there's no real resolution or peace treaty.
Okay.
It's a ceasefire, but not a true peace. Ukraine would be left significantly weakened with Russia in control of large portions of its territory. The conflict wouldn't be actively raging, but it wouldn't be resolved either. It would be frozen with the potential to reignite at any moment.
So a frozen conflict sounds like a very precarious and unstable situation.
Yeah, very much so.
What are the potential consequences of such a scenario, not just for Ukraine, but for the wider region?
Well, Mearsheimer paints a rather bleak picture. He argues that a frozen conflict would leave Ukraine deeply divided and struggling to function effectively, and he believes that Russia would likely continue to exert influence and control over the occupied territories, essentially creating a permanent state of tension and instability in the region.
That's a sobering thought, especially considering the potential for this frozen conflict to thaw and reignite into open warfare. It sounds like a recipe for continued suffering and uncertainty, not just for Ukraine, but for everyone involved.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer doesn't stop there. He goes on to identify 6 potential flashpoints in Eastern Europe where tensions between the West and Russia could easily escalate, turning this frozen conflict into something far more dangerous.
Whoa, 6 flashpoints.
Yeah.
That sounds like a lot of potential for trouble.
It is.
So let's dive into those a bit further. What are these flashpoints, and why are they so concerning in the context of this already tense situation?
He specifically points to the Arctic, the Baltic region, Belarus, Kaliningrad, Moldova, and the Black Sea as areas where even a minor incident could spiral out of control.
Wow.
Potentially drawing in other countries and sparking a wider conflict. These areas are already characterized by heightened military activity and political sensitivities, making them particularly vulnerable to escalation.
So we're talking about a situation where a seemingly minor event could have major ripple effects.
Yeah.
Potentially dragging the entire region back into open conflict. That's a pretty frightening prospect.
It is, and that's precisely why Mearsheimer believes that understanding these potential flashpoints is crucial. He argues that by recognizing the risks and taking proactive steps to manage tensions, we might be able to prevent a frozen conflict from thawing into something far more catastrophic.
That's a great point. It seems like recognizing and understanding these potential flashpoints is crucial for anyone who wants to grasp the full scope of the risks involved in this conflict.
Absolutely. It's not just about understanding the current situation, though. Mearsheimer also highlights the importance of recognizing the historical and geopolitical context that led us to this point.
You're right, context is key. So what does Mearsheimer have to say about the events and decisions that led us to this point? What's his take on the historical backstory of this conflict?
Well, he spends a considerable amount of time discussing NATO expansion and its role in escalating tensions with Russia. He argues that the West's decision to expand NATO eastward, despite Russia's repeated objections, created a security dilemma that ultimately contributed to the current crisis.
That's a perspective we often hear from Russia, but it's interesting to see a prominent Western scholar like Mearsheimer echoing that view. But doesn't the West argue that NATO expansion was purely defensive, aimed at protecting new democracies from Russian aggression?
That's certainly the prevailing narrative in the West. However, Mearsheimer challenges that view, arguing that Russia, from its perspective, saw NATO expansion as an existential threat, a gradual encirclement that undermined its security interests.
I see.
And he suggests that this perceived threat, combined with other factors, created a climate of mistrust and hostility that ultimately made conflict more likely.
So what you're saying is that even if the West's intentions were purely defensive, the way those actions were perceived by Russia matters. It's about understanding the other side's perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
Exactly. And that's where Mearsheimer's analysis gets really interesting. He forces us to step outside of our own perspective and consider how our actions might have been perceived by Russia, regardless of our intentions. It's a crucial insight that helps us understand the complex dynamics that led to this conflict.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in our own narrative and assume that our intentions are clear and our actions justified. But as Mearsheimer points out, perception matters just as much as intention, especially in international relations.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another key aspect of Mearsheimer's analysis, the importance of understanding Putin's worldview and motivations.
Okay, let's delve into that. What does Mearsheimer say about Putin and his role in all of this?
He argues that Putin is a realist, a leader driven by a desire to protect Russia's national interests and restore its status as a great power. He sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragedy, a geopolitical catastrophe that weakened Russia and left it vulnerable.
That's a perspective we often hear from Putin himself. He frequently talks about the need to restore Russia's greatness and reclaim its rightful place on the world stage.
Precisely. And Mearsheimer suggests that understanding this worldview is key to understanding Putin's actions. He argues that Putin sees Ukraine as a vital buffer zone between Russia and the West, a crucial part of Russia's historical sphere of influence that cannot be allowed to slip into the Western orbit.
That explains why Putin reacted so strongly to the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. He sees it as a direct threat to Russia's security and a violation of what he considers to be Russia's legitimate interests in the region.
Exactly. And this leads Mearsheimer to another provocative argument that the West, by pushing for Ukraine's integration into NATO, essentially forced Putin's hand. He argues that the West's actions left Putin with no good options, ultimately making conflict almost inevitable.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
So Mearsheimer is essentially saying that the West's policies, particularly its support for NATO expansion, created the conditions that made war more likely.
That's the core of his argument. He believes that the West failed to grasp the depth of Russia's security concerns and pushed for policies that were perceived as deeply threatening by Moscow. In his view, this miscalculation helped pave the way for the current conflict.
That's a lot to take in. We've covered a lot of ground here, from Mearsheimer's critique of the West's role in the conflict to his analysis of Putin's motivations. But there's one key point I want to circle back to: the concept of a frozen conflict.
Right.
It's a chilling prospect, isn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that this conflict could become a permanent fixture of the European security landscape with the potential to erupt at any moment is deeply unsettling.
Absolutely. It is a very unsettling thought.
Can you elaborate a bit more on what life might look like for Ukrainians if this conflict does indeed become frozen? What are the potential implications for their daily lives, for their economy, for their future as a nation?
Well, a frozen conflict would likely mean continued division and instability for Ukraine. It could lead to a permanent partition of the country, with Russia controlling large swaths of territory, creating a constant source of tension and potential violence.
That sounds like a nightmare scenario for Ukrainians. They've already endured so much suffering and displacement. The thought of this conflict becoming a permanent fixture of their lives is heartbreaking.
Absolutely. And beyond the human cost, a frozen conflict would also have profound economic and political implications for Ukraine. It would likely hinder investment, hamper economic growth, and make it extremely difficult for Ukraine to build a stable and prosperous future.
So a frozen conflict is not just about a ceasefire, it's about a prolonged state of limbo, of uncertainty, of fear. It's about a future where the threat of violence always looms, and where the possibility of genuine peace and reconciliation seems distant.
That's a very apt description. And it's why Mearsheimer's analysis is so sobering. He's not just offering an explanation for the current conflict. He's issuing a warning about the potential for this crisis to become a chronic festering wound on the European continent.
That's a powerful image, a wound that never fully heals, always prone to reopening and causing further pain and suffering.
Precisely. And it's why understanding the dynamics of this conflict, the motivations of the actors involved, and the potential consequences of a frozen conflict is so crucial. We need to be aware of the risks, not just to Ukraine, but to the broader region and the international order as a whole.
You've given us a lot to think about here. Mearsheimer's perspective is certainly thought-provoking, even if it's not always comfortable to confront. But before we wrap up part one of this deep dive, I want to circle back to one key element of his analysis that we haven't fully explored yet, his predictions about how this conflict might play out in the coming months and years.
Right.
And that's a crucial aspect of his argument, and it's one that I think deserves our full attention.
Yeah, I think so too.
So let's pick up there in part two.
Sounds good. So Mearsheimer doesn't mince words. When he lays out his predictions, he's quite pessimistic about the prospects for a negotiated settlement, at least in the near term.
Yeah.
He believes that both sides are too entrenched in their positions, too unwilling to compromise on what they see as, core interests.
That's certainly in line with what we're seeing on the ground. Neither Russia nor Ukraine seems willing to back down, and the fighting continues with no clear end in sight.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer believes that this stalemate could continue for quite some time, potentially dragging on for years or even decades. And he points to other frozen conflicts like the one in Korea as examples of how these situations can fester unresolved for generations.
Yeah, the Korean War is a powerful example. It technically ended in an armistice in 1953, but the two Koreas are still technically at war, and the peninsula remains a major flashpoint. It's a sobering reminder that these frozen conflicts can have very long shadows.
They can indeed. And Mearsheimer argues that a frozen conflict in Ukraine would have similarly far-reaching consequences, not just for the region, but for the global order as a whole. He believes that it would further exacerbate tensions between Russia and the West, fuel a new arms race, and undermine international cooperation on a range of critical issues.
So what you're saying is that a frozen conflict wouldn't just be a local problem. It would have global implications, potentially destabilizing the entire international system.
That's precisely Mearsheimer's point. He sees this conflict as a symptom of a much larger geopolitical shift, a return to great power rivalry that could have profound implications for the 21st century.
It's a pretty daunting thought, the idea that we're entering a new era of great power competition, one marked by heightened tensions, mistrust, and the potential for conflict.
It's certainly a sobering prospect and one that demands our full attention. But, Mearsheimer doesn't just offer a pessimistic outlook. He also suggests some potential ways forward, some steps that could be taken to mitigate the risks and prevent this conflict from spiraling further out of control.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about those potential solutions. What does Mearsheimer suggest as a way out of this impasse?
Well, he acknowledges that, finding a solution won't be easy given the deep mistrust and competing interests at play. But he argues that the first step is for both sides to recognize the need for compromise.
Right.
He believes that neither Russia nor the West can achieve its objectives through force alone, and that a negotiated settlement is the only path to a durable peace.
Compromise is a word we don't hear very often these days, especially in the context of such a high-stakes conflict. What kind of compromises does Mearsheimer have in mind? What would a negotiated settlement look like, in his view?
Well, he suggests that a realistic settlement would likely involve some painful concessions from both sides. For Russia, this might mean abandoning its maximalist goals of regime change in Kyiv and accepting a neutral Ukraine that is not formally aligned with NATO.
Okay.
For the West, it could mean recognizing Russia's legitimate security concerns and offering guarantees that NATO will not expand further eastward.
Those are some pretty significant concessions, especially for the West. Accepting a neutral Ukraine and limiting NATO expansion would be a major shift in policy, one that would likely face strong opposition from many quarters.
Absolutely. Mearsheimer acknowledges that these compromises would be difficult for both sides to swallow, but he argues that they are necessary to avoid a protracted and potentially catastrophic conflict. He believes that the alternative, a frozen conflict that could last for decades and destabilize the entire region, is simply too dangerous to contemplate.
So Mearsheimer is essentially saying that both sides need to step back from the brink and accept that their original goals may no longer be achievable.
Yeah.
They need to find a way to de-escalate the situation and create a new security architecture in Europe that addresses the concerns of all parties involved.
That's a very good summary of his argument. He believes that the current security arrangements in Europe are simply not sustainable and that a new approach is needed to prevent further conflict and instability.
That's a pretty tall order, especially given the current level of mistrust and animosity between Russia and the West.
It is a tall order, yeah.
But I think Mearsheimer's analysis highlights the urgent need for creative diplomacy and a willingness to re-examine long-held assumptions. We can't simply keep doing things the way we've always done them and expect a different outcome.
I completely agree. This conflict has exposed some fundamental flaws in the European security order, and it's clear that a new approach is needed. But finding that new approach won't be easy. It will require difficult conversations, painful compromises, and a willingness to think outside the box.
It's a daunting challenge, but one that we can't afford to ignore. The stakes are simply too high to allow this conflict to fester unresolved. We need to find a way to move beyond the current blame game and start working towards a more stable and secure future for Europe.
And that's where Mearsheimer's analysis can be so valuable. He challenges us to think critically about the conflict, to understand the perspectives of all sides involved, and to consider alternative paths forward. Even if we don't agree with all of his conclusions, his work forces us to grapple with the complexity of the situation and to avoid simplistic solutions.
You're right. Mearsheimer's analysis is a reminder that there are no easy answers in this conflict. It's a complex web of historical grievances, geopolitical rivalries, and competing security interests. But by understanding these complexities, by engaging in honest and open dialogue, and by being willing to compromise, we might just be able to find a way out of this impasse.
I think that's a key takeaway from our deep dive today. This conflict is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of Europe and the global order. And it's a conflict that demands our attention, our critical thinking, and our commitment to finding a peaceful resolution.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I think you've given our listeners a lot to ponder. Mearsheimer's analysis is certainly thought-provoking, even if it challenges some of our deeply held assumptions.
Right. It's always good to, challenge those assumptions.
But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to one final point.
Yep.
That Mearsheimer makes the importance of understanding the role of the United States in this conflict.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, and one that I think deserves its own segment.
Yeah.
So let's delve into that in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Russia and Ukraine. But what about the United States? Where does America fit into Mearsheimer's analysis of this conflict?
Well, Mearsheimer argues that the U.S. plays a pivotal role, perhaps even the most crucial role, in shaping the trajectory of this conflict. He sees the U.S. as the leading power in the West, the architect of NATO expansion, and the primary driver of the policies that, in his view, provoked Russia and led to the current crisis.
That's a pretty strong statement. So Mearsheimer is essentially saying that the U.S. bears a significant responsibility for the outbreak of this war.
Yeah, that's the essence of his argument. He believes that the U.S., in its pursuit of expanding NATO and promoting democracy in Ukraine, failed to adequately consider Russia's security concerns and ultimately pushed Putin into a corner, leaving him with few options other than military action.
That's a controversial perspective, to say the least. But it's interesting to consider how U.S. policy might have been perceived from Moscow's perspective. We often talk about the importance of understanding the other side's point of view, and Mearsheimer's analysis certainly forces us to do that.
It does indeed. He challenges us to step outside of our own assumptions and consider how our actions might have been interpreted by Russia regardless of our intentions. He argues that the U.S., in its drive to promote a liberal world order, failed to appreciate the deeply held security anxieties of a country that had experienced a traumatic collapse of its empire and a period of profound weakness.
Right. Russia has a long history of feeling threatened by its neighbors, and the collapse of the Soviet Union must have been a deeply unsettling experience. It's understandable that they would be sensitive to any perceived attempts to encroach on their sphere of influence.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer argues that the U.S., in its zeal to extend its influence and promote its values, failed to grasp the depth of Russia's anxieties and the potential for its actions to be perceived as aggressive and threatening.
So if Mearsheimer believes that the U.S. bears a significant responsibility for this conflict, what does he suggest as a way forward? What role does he see the U.S. playing in resolving this crisis?
Well, he argues that the U.S. needs to fundamentally rethink its approach to Russia and Ukraine. He believes that the current policy of confrontation and containment is counterproductive and will only lead to further escalation and instability. Instead, he advocates for a more pragmatic approach, one that recognizes Russia's legitimate security interests and seeks to find areas of cooperation rather than conflict.
That sounds like a pretty radical departure from current U.S. policy. It would require a major shift in thinking both within the U.S. government and among the American public.
It would indeed. But Mearsheimer argues that such a shift is necessary if we want to avoid a prolonged and dangerous confrontation with Russia. He believes that the U.S. needs to accept that Ukraine will not become a Western-style democracy and that its future lies in some form of neutrality or accommodation with Russia. He also argues that the U.S. should focus on building a more stable and cooperative relationship with Russia, one based on mutual respect and a recognition of shared interests.
That's a tall order, especially given the current state of relations between the U.S. and Russia.
It's certainly a challenging path, but one that I think is worth exploring. Mearsheimer's work forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the U.S. role in this conflict and to consider alternative approaches that might lead to a more stable and peaceful future.
It's been a really fascinating deep dive, and I think you've given our listeners a lot to think of. Mearsheimer's analysis is certainly thought-provoking, even if it challenges some of our deeply held assumptions.
I think that's the value of, engaging with diverse perspectives, even those that might make us uncomfortable. It helps us to broaden our understanding of complex issues and to consider alternative solutions that we might not have otherwise considered.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those insightful sources coming.